Welcome to the Tech Money Podcast, where the worlds of technology and personal finance collide. Hosted by certified financial planner, speaker, blogger, and self-proclaimed personal finance nerd, Malcolm Ethridge. Each episode aims to make you just a little bit smarter about your money, all from the perspective of the tech professional. Without further delay, here's your host.
Hey there, listeners. Malcolm here. And on today's show, we're talking about estate planning. More specifically, we're talking about some lesser-known estate planning challenges for those who hold a concentrated equity position in the company they work for. Though it may seem like a very distant and high-class problem that only the super wealthy among us will ever have to contend with, for many tech workers who have accumulated a significant size stake in their employer, it's not unlikely that estate taxes are something they'll have to consider as part of their overall financial plan at some point. In fact, with the number of bills currently floating around the halls of Congress with the intention to increase tax revenue by lowering the estate and gift tax thresholds, there could be significantly more Americans who will be impacted by this problem soon enough. And while the importance of a well-crafted estate plan is certainly an issue I am passionate about, I am by no means the expert in this arena. So I decided to call up someone who is and have a conversation. My guest, Aaron Rubin, is a partner at Werba, Rubin, and Papier, a wealth management firm catering to pre-IPO executives and early employees. Prior to his current firm, Aaron spent time at Deloitte, where he worked on trusts and estates, as well as honed his skills in their private client advisory department. Aaron also received his JD from University of Illinois, and in 2019, he published Financial Adulting, a guide to help young professionals navigate the challenges of taxes, investments, and estate planning. So, with that brief introduction, welcome Aaron Rubin to the Tech Money Podcast.
Gosh, it's fantastic to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you making the time to do this, man. So I breezed through your resume pretty quickly there in my intro. What else should I have included?
Yeah, so I've been working in the industry that I'm working in currently, wealth management / tax, for about 10 years now, 12 years. Now that I think about it. And it's been really interesting to see kind of all the different tech companies go public and to really get deep into, again, a lot of the tax issues that do pop up for people. So again, I have a good amount of experience there. And again, it's been great.
So you may have actually answered this question for me, but I'll in your response just now, but I'll ask it anyway, which is, as somebody who's been to law school, passed the CPA exam, and passed the CFP exam, what do you actually consider yourself? Like, are you a lawyer who likes taxes and financial planning too, an accountant who likes tax law and financial planning, or a financial planner who wanted to be able to give legal and accounting advice and is an overachiever, and that was the only way you could do it?
Right. So, well, if you ask my mother, she'll tell you I'm not a real lawyer. That's her. No, I actually, when I went to undergrad, I discovered I loved tax and I loved accounting, which made me a very sick person. And during that time, I also decided I was going to go to law school. So that's what I did. And in my second year of law school, I ended up meeting my wife, and her father was in the financial planning business. And so after law school and after we decided to get married, he said, well, how do you want to work for me? I said, sure. And so it was one of those things where, I got into it because the opportunity arose. And so, I didn't know that's what I was going to be doing. Would I have gone to law school if I would have known that was my path? I don't know. Probably. It's been very helpful for a background. And certainly the CPA part has been exceptionally helpful. And to put out something you said, I do not give legal advice. So that's one thing. I am not a practicing attorney, and I tell all my clients that, it's when they want me to do their wills or trusts, the answer is no. There are people who specialize in that, who that's like what they do, eat, breathe all day. And they're the ones that I refer to for that sort of work. And even the tax stuff, I know a lot about it. I've, done all the education, have the experience. A lot of times, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of it, I will, I'll turn it over to my team. We have a tax director who's, again, she eats, breathes, lives this stuff. So I sort of combine kind of all those worlds. So I guess that's a really roundabout way to say, I started off as an accountant who became a CPA, who then decided to become a financial planner, CFP. And now I'm sort of a CFP that just so happens to have all of those things. And I do the tax planning as well.
Yeah, I guess I should say for the audience listening to this, who the majority of them are not financial services professionals, so they may not even have gotten the nuance in the question I was asking, but so much of each industry I just described, what's the word I'm looking for, prevents you or prohibits you from giving advice on the other two things in the way that it's written. And so people will go as far as to get, JD, CPA, and CFP to be able to legally give advice in all three domains, right? So if you're an accountant, you're cautioned against giving legal advice and giving investment advice, and then for the other two, vice versa. And so I asked that question somewhat jokingly, but also out of curiosity, because anytime I see those three letters next to somebody's name, I'm always like, well, which one is the thing that you consider? Sure. And then what's the other stuff that you added in later? Because you're like, well, this, either makes me more well-rounded or keeps me from running afoul of regulators. But anyway, so I mentioned in my intro, that you guys work with executives and early employees from late stage startups, but could you define, you guys' clientele and your area of expertise a little bit better for us? I'm sure there's more to it than that.
Yeah. So our clients typically have worked at a place for a while. Either they founded it, or maybe, again, if it's a bigger company, their employees, 1 through 200. Mm-hmm. And they start off early enough that they got a very sizable portion of stock options, or if they were founders, they actually got stock right off the bat. Mm-hmm. And so, what we do is we help them think through some of those decisions before the company goes public, because there's a lot to do before an IPO happens, before an S1 happens. I mean, geez, even before around D funding or around E funding happens, there's things that you should do to set yourself up for success down the line that will make sure that when your tax time comes, right? And at some point, again, there are exceptions, but at some point tax time is going to come where you have to pay something. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you've set yourself up so that you can maximize what you get to keep, because the government always has its hand in your pocket. And if we can help design a plan that gives you more, that means you can, either one, obviously your lifestyle, right? If you want to spend on yourself, fine. I think our clients tend to think about things a little bit differently. I think our clients tend to think about their kids and grandkids, if they have grandkids at that point. Usually they don't, or they're thinking about charities. Mm-hmm. And the more you can keep for yourself, the more you can do and help the people you love. So yeah, it's about taking that early employee and really helping them maximize what they can do.
Well, stay there for a minute. You mentioned founders a couple of times, and I'll come back to that in a second, but you guys have been a part of several IPOs vicariously through your clients, right? Through the years, you guys have been operating in this space. What's the best thing you've seen someone do following an IPO announcement that was like evident that company was going to go public? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's a really hard thing to say, that it's evident, because look at places like WeWork. Mm-hmm. They were like a week out from listing, and then the whole thing sort of imploded. So there's never any certainty around it. So you still have to be careful, even when, what people really look for is when you file that S1. Mm-hmm. And the S1, right, is your declaration that, we're going public soon. Then you have your road shows, and all that good stuff.
Well, to your point, though, we didn't get any of the really nitty gritty on WeWork until they filed the S1, which was their way to kind of shove it through the door as fast as they possibly could. So even sure. Then, it doesn't necessarily mean anything's guaranteed. I appreciate you actually pointing that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think for, again, you can be reasonably certain, right, when the S1's filed that it's going to happen pretty darn soon. Mm-hmm. But for my clients, I think a lot of it depends on what kind of listing it is. So, like, for instance, we were working with people at Coinbase, and Coinbase was a direct listing. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a direct listing, you don't have typically the same lockup periods that you do than if it's like an IPO or a mm-hmm. SPAC. So for everyone that I talked to, and not everyone became clients, but everyone I talked to at Coinbase, their strategy was, as soon as this thing is tradable, I'm trading. Mm-hmm. They could have done some exercising and holding, but I think they realized how fickle crypto markets were. And they said, I don't want my fate tied to that. And so a lot of those people, a lot of the employees that I talked to, at least, they made that smart call of saying, hey, you know what? This is found money and I'm not wasting this, and I'm not taking the risk.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you know it, they were right. And at least for now, we'll see what happens in the next few years. I don't have a crystal ball on Coinbase, but for those that are still like sitting on the options piece of it, and if it's an IPO or a SPAC, right, there's probably going to be 6 months that you're not going to be able to trade. The trend is that after the first earnings, employees get to trade some amount, whether it's 10 to 20%, 25%, something like that. And then after the second earnings call, then they get to sell another additional portion. Then by 6 months, then they can fully sell whatever they want to, assuming that the window is still open for them. All of that being said, if your company files at S1 and you're really confident that in the next probably month or two, it's going to be going public, then the time might be right to exercise, but you got to be super careful, because you can find yourself in a jam if you're exercising a bunch of incentive stock options. Let's say it happens in third quarter of the year. Again, no one's IPOing right now, so it doesn't really matter. But in normal years, right, where the market's generally up, if you exercise a bunch of ISOs, you create a huge tax bill on the ISO side of things in third, fourth quarter of the year. You're going to owe the tax by April of the following year.
Sure.
And so you might not be able to sell and you don't want to find yourself in that situation. And so, I think the people that make, again, they think through those sorts of decisions. They work with CPAs, or they work, and again, if attorneys probably not, but again, working with your CPA to understand all these consequences, I think that's what really smart people do, and they do it early on. But if you didn't do it early on, if you're doing it when that S1 comes out, to try to form a strategy behind your buying and the selling, that I think is what really smart people do.
But have you seen anybody do anything? I guess I'll ask the question a little bit differently. Have you seen anybody do anything maybe interesting when the announcement has been made, right? Like you mentioned, folks want to give to charity, or folks want to, go out and make a big purchase or something like that. A lot of times, early employees at one startup will go found a new startup themselves, with that liquidity event being the seed money that helps them start that thing. Like, have you seen anybody do anything really interesting and unique following an IPO?
Oh, following an IPO. Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to people doing things interesting after the S1 comes out, or after it becomes obvious there will be an IPO. After the IPO, sure. Again, on people that are entrepreneurs, they don't, just because they hit once, they can't give up. they're ever entrepreneurs. And so we certainly have clients that, as soon as they're able to get some liquidity, they immediately, start to try to fund a new venture. And that's always really exciting. And the planning opportunity, obviously you need to think through it, because, again, if you're starting something up, you're not going to get paid for several years. And so you need to, think through, hey, I need to make sure I have the cash available to me.
Yeah.
So again, we talk a lot about that with people.
Hey there, listeners. It's Eric with an A, and I'm interrupting the show for just a moment to tell you about our newest offering, the Tech Money Guide to Restricted Stock Units. This guide was developed to teach those who are paid in RSUs to develop a plan for how and when to convert those shares into actual dollars, as well as how to incorporate them into your overall personal financial plan. You may have already heard episode 50, where Malcolm described the guide in detail, as well as his own philosophy and rules of thumb when it comes to managing this valuable form of equity compensation. If you haven't, no problem. We would still encourage you to head on over to tech-money.com and download a free copy of the guide today. There's also a link to it in the show notes of this episode. Again, that web address is tech-money.com, and you can download a free copy of the guide right there from the homepage. In keeping with the promise of this show, our hope is that the Tech Money Guide to Restricted Stock Units helps make you just a little smarter about your money. Now back to the show.
Okay, so since this is the place tech workers come to get smarter about their money, one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on is that I don't think we talk enough about what to do with concentrated equity positions when we talk about estate planning as financial planners and financial professionals. Typically, the conventional wisdom is to just hold on to the stock until you die, right? Borrow against it if you need liquidity. And, I don't know, maybe you want to buy a social media platform or something and you got to get your hands on $40 billion just at the drop of a hat, right? Then you allow your kids to come in and assume the new basis that's established on the date you pass away. And then finally, they sell the stock for next to no taxes and ride off into the sunset. That's really the only plan. And, it's a good one. It's tried and true. It's been working. So what am I missing here from an estate planning perspective, you think?
Sure. So I would say if your plan is to wait, borrow, and die, and you're a young tech worker, let's say again, the young's relative, right? But you're in your 30s or 40s and you're waiting 40 or 50 years, for your kids to get. I mean, one, a lot can happen with that particular stock. So there's danger in that concentration. And if you need to borrow against it, again, you're going to pay interest for the rest of your life, and again, there are some issues kind of buried in there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think when you think through some of the challenges when you have stock like that, I think there are a couple things that people can do, and I think the first one is if you have stock, obviously, if you bought it earlier on, let's say let's say you got in the B round or maybe A round type of shares, and let's say you had exercised it,
mm-hmm.
and you're sitting on this huge gain. It could be that you have what's called qualified small business stock,
mm-hmm.
and you've qualified small business stock. You're up to, for purposes of our discussion here, up to $10 million. You're going to get tax free.
Yep,
and that tax free number is per entity or per individual. So you can take that stock you have and potentially split it into different trusts. You can gift parts of it to certain people. Again, depending on the size of the transaction, there's gift tax involved. There's all sorts of things to be aware of. I tell clients this all the time. I can spend all of your money
mm-hmm.
on estate planning. I know some people they'll do lots of work for you, but you got to figure out, one, if it's worth it. Two, are you actually going to get the benefit you think you're going to get? And that's tough because, the earlier you put it into one of these trusts, the better off you're going to be, but the less certainty you have. So, you really have to think through that cost benefit there, and you really have to make a judgment call.
That's a fair point, because I figured you were going to tell me, the real key is to transfer ownership of your equity to a trust while the value is still relatively low. And then the future appreciation in that equity isn't hit with estate taxes once I pass away and leave it to my heirs and so forth and so on. But I guess the question is, who would you say should actually be concerned about this, right? I may be listening and thinking that really only applies to the founder, right? When you talk about QSBS and maybe a couple of, I guess the founder and a couple of co-founders, right, of the company, since they presumably own the lion's share of the equity when the price is at $1 per share or something. What's the real profile of this person you're talking about? You mentioned before, employees 1 through 200 or something like that. But what's the profile of who you think should be worried about qualified small business stock in that $10 million exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, if you came to a company, and again, this is generalizations, right? If you came to the company before you got your C round of funding,
mm-hmm.
that's Charlie. Your C round of funding, you likely have some sort of qualified small business stock, assuming you meet all the other requirements. And there's a litany of requirements to actually get qualified for it.
Mm-hmm.
But, we've talked with people, they were early on at LinkedIn. Now, they didn't have $80 million, they didn't have $100 million.
Sure.
He had 10 or 12, right? Perfect. Great. And, he could sell his shares for, essentially, no additional cost. Now, when do you For tax, and again, the tax cost, by the way, that QSBS, if you're a California resident, there's no QSBS in California. So you're going to be paying California tax. But that notwithstanding, when do you start thinking about doing trusts, sub-trusts, really complex planning? I think for a lot of people, it is usually at that founder level when you start wanting to do that. Certainly, if you're like a really early employee, 1 through 25, and and again, you've gotten that B round, and now all of a sudden, there's 50 other people around you, and things are going really well. You have to make that decision of, okay, is this company going to be, Amazon, which no one's going to be Amazon, but is this company really going to take off?
Yeah.
And if you think that's really going to happen, maybe it makes sense to drop the $10,000 to $20,000 on estate planning to get all those trusts and everything done. Again, that's a risk though. That's money that's not going to come back to you. So if you do it, and then all of a sudden, wouldn't you know it, Apple decides to pick up your company and you get a $5 million payout, you'll feel pretty stupid. But again, it's one of those things where you part of it's just sort of reading the room and understanding the vision of the founders and the investors and saying, okay, this really is going to go public. So again, a lot of it's a judgment call, which is tough because again, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule to say, okay, well, if you have 2 million shares now, you definitely want to do that. And then the other side of that is if it's not stock, if it's just options, you still have to pay for them, right? And if you have 400,000 shares at 50 cents a share, you still got to come up with $200,000 to buy this. And a lot of people, again, it might be their first rodeo, and they don't have $200,000 to do that sort of thing.
Well, when we talk about like the need to focus on estate planning, I'm not necessarily thinking about the younger person who this is their first rodeo necessarily, right? Like that is maybe, depending on, like you said, how early on you are and the size of where the company's grown to, that may be an issue. But I'm thinking about the serial startup employee with this one, right? The person who's already worked for 2 or 3 startups in the past that did, you said let's not look at Amazon, but let's just say somebody who did like mediumly well, which I know isn't grammatically correct, but follow me here. So, they had 2 or 3 exits and made enough money to know that they'll be set for the rest of their life as long as they don't, go buy an island and then a jet to get to the island, right?
Yep.
That person's decided to take a role at another startup and their employee number like 10 or something, right? So the equity is worth like 50 cents or something to, like you said, they could put their $100,000 worth of shares into a trust almost immediately, only use $100,000 of their gift tax exclusion. And since that's all they're worth, if those shares are worth maybe $1 million down the road, not anything crazy, for the sake of easy math, like the remaining $900,000 of appreciation would have escaped estate taxes. Am I characterizing that right, or am I missing something?
Yeah, again, you move things into trust and they can escape estate tax. Now, if depending on I'm assuming your estate planning attorney is worth their salt, and it's an intentionally defective trust, where you're going to get out of the estate, but you're going to pay the income tax. And again, you can do some really big benefit. You can do some really great things with that.
Well, stay there for a second. What's an intentionally defective trust? What are we talking about here?
Right. So an intentionally defective trust is essentially what you do is you have your, you go to an estate planning attorney and you say, hey, I have all these shares and I need to get them out of my estate, essentially. And so, you put them inside of a trust, which hopefully the company lets you do because there's restrictions, and the income from that trust ends up getting reported on your tax return, because what has happened is the estate planning attorney has made the trust defective in some way such that the income gets tagged to you, the grantor. So you're paying the tax for whatever happens inside of that trust. However, it is not, for estate planning purposes, part of the estate. So you kind of get it out of the estate, and because you're paying the tax on it, sort of your tax gets to leave the estate too, because it goes with the government. So whoever is the beneficiary on that trust gets an asset that's bigger than what it would have been otherwise, because again, you got it in early, it's appreciated, and now this person gets to use it.
Yeah, Well, here's something else you just made me think about, and I'll ask this one just for my own edification, honestly, in the audience, and kind of just come along for the ride on this one. But like, I'm thinking, if I have someone who owns shares in Apple or IBM, for example, right, and they've been there forever, and they want to put that stock into their revocable living trust because they're going to continue to hold on to it forever, and their kids and grandkids better hold on to it forever too, right? We would just use something called the securities assignment, right, to reassign ownership to the trust instead of to the individual. So like, this is the tactical, how do we get the shares out of my individual ownership and into the ownership of the trust, right? But I've never run into this problem where the person's stock is in a private company before. Yep. What would you do in that instance? Like, is it the same? I assume it's not the same document, because that's got to be like for publicly traded stock. So what would you do?
Yeah, your main issue when you're trying to take non-publicly traded stock and put it into any kind of trust is that, all these stocks have pretty intense restrictions on them. You can't just move them to whoever you want, wherever you want. A lot of times you're going to need, you may need board approval. You may need an exception to be made to move them. Sometimes they will let you put them in, a grantor trust. So you can, again, that's not like a huge deal. Because obviously a lot of the founders, they need to do their estate work too. And they don't want to die, and have all these shares going through probate. That's like the last thing they want. Yeah. So again, it's you don't necessarily need a different document. I'm assuming, when you're talking about securities assignment, you're talking about like a living revocable trust. Is that right? Or are you talking about something a little bit different? Okay. So yeah, I mean, it's possible to move it. If they're stock options, less of a problem, because stock options are sitting inside of a qualified plan. Qualified plans all have beneficiaries. You assign the beneficiary, to be your trust. You can get around some of that. Yeah. But if you're just holding the stock outright, again, hopefully the company will realize that moving it into a revocable trust is for the benefit of both parties.
Yeah. You bring up a whole other point that I learned unintentionally recently, which was that incentive stock. I didn't think you could transfer unexercised incentive stock options into a living trust, but apparently you can. And something I'll throw out there, just in case somebody listening to this is going through this in their brain and it's relevant. It's the fact that the trustee just has to be specifically authorized to exercise those options on behalf of the person who granted them to the trust. Is that like a common occurrence, since you bring that up, or is that more of just like a one-off that's kind of rare?
So I've never seen that. So your issue with unexercised stock options is that technically you don't have an ownership interest in anything yet, which makes it difficult to transfer. You can't transfer something you don't own. Can you transfer the right to exercise the stock to somebody else? You know what? I've never seen it. And I'm not sure when you'd want to use that either, because I think and again, this is just a guess because I've never seen it, but you're still going to be subject to all the restrictions of insider trading and all that. So even if you make it somebody else's decision, I'm not quite sure what you're going to accomplish.
Yeah. I again, this is like extremely wonky and extremely nuanced, but I think, if nothing else, you're sort of reaffirming the opinion of folks who say it's important to exercise early, because then you have the freedom and flexibility to make a lot of these decisions that we're talking about.
Yeah, and exercising early is super important. That if you have the opportunity, you have the money, you go out there and you get your shares for essentially no tax cost, and you let them vest over time, and you start the clock on QSBS, you start the clock on long-term capital gains, and you enjoy.
Well, when do you think is like the right time to be making one of these types of gifts that we're talking about to a trust, regardless of the type of trust? Not necessarily an age, but like what's happening in that person's life as a startup employee that would make you say, yep, time to start gifting shares to your trust?
Again, it goes back to hey, this could be a judgment call, or it is a judgment call. That, all this, usually it's, again, you're looking at your A round or your seed round, you have a product of some sort. You still are not sure what kind of legs it's going to have. By the time you get to that B round, you may have had some sales, And if all of a sudden you start looking at that and be like, wait a second, this is actually really taking off, that might be a great time to start thinking about moving some things around. Certainly the C round, you're probably trying to scale a little bit on production, and you've proven, this there's a market and it's going to be strong. Ideally, it's that B round, because again, when you go to move those shares into the trust, especially if we're looking at irrevocable trusts and qualified small business stock type trusts and potentially defective trusts, all that good stuff. When you look at that decision, when you move shares over, they're valued at the value of the time you make the transfer. They're not valued at the grant price, right? Because you still might pay 50 cents a share for them. But if the fair market value is $5 a share, for gift tax purposes, you're going to be using $5 a share. If you wait until the C round, it might be $20 a share. And maybe at that point, it's prohibitively expensive, depending on, if you've used your exclusion prior to that.
Sure.
So again, the longer you wait, the more exclusion you're going to use per transfer. So again, the earlier you sort of recognize, oh my gosh, this thing's going to be huge, the better off you're going to be. Now, it's a problem because I'll go back to that original Coinbase story. I don't think anyone at Coinbase thought it was going to end up being as big as it was. So again, it would have taken a lot of vision for someone to do that. But if you got it, then go out and spend the money on the estate planning.
Well, I would say to the counter to that point, I guess, it's usually the founder, if nobody else, who does think that it's going to be, what it is, to use your earlier example, right? Nobody but Adam Newman thought other people were crazy enough to pay to rent desks. And then all of a sudden they were in multiple countries, right? And so I guess to your point, if you are founder or early stage employee, you believe in the company enough that maybe it is worth it to you to put those shares into a trust early on to protect your future value from estate taxes and everything else that comes along with it.
Well, yeah. And it's not only estate tax, but it's income tax, which is huge. And if you're the founder and you've had a couple of, good successes, and you're totally comfortable and you got the $10,000 to $20,000 to burn, go do it. I mean, go save your estate and your family, hundreds of millions of dollars. Go for it.
Yeah, you may have just answered this unintentionally, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case. Before we get ready to wrap, what would be your main message to folks who are sitting on, shares from a startup that they have a super low basis in because, they got there early on, but their plan is to worry about the taxes and other estate issues once they IPO? They're just, they're too busy right now, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's be surprising to anyone who's been listening to this. Don't wait. Talk to an advisor, whether it's a financial advisor. Definitely get some tax help on it. Invest the time now, and you are going to be rewarded later on. And so again, I'd say that's the big thing. Plan for the tax now, because it's tough to see, someone comes in and says, oh yeah, I've got $20 million of XYZ company. It's like, well, no, you don't. you have $20 million less, perhaps 50%. Because between again, I'm in California, where the taxes are ridiculous. I know you're in the East Coast and taxes aren't a whole lot better, but 50% might be going out the door.
Yeah.
But had you taken some steps, a couple of years before then, maybe it would have only been 30%, and that's not something to sneeze at. If you're talking about saving $4 million, geez, go do that every day.
Fair enough. Well, my last question actually has probably absolutely nothing to do with taxes or estate planning. So you can relax your shoulders a little bit, sit back and relax for a little bit for this one. But let's say you never found your passion for those two things, taxes and estate planning. So you had to find a different way to occupy your days, but money wasn't a factor in your decision-making at all. What do you think you'd be doing right now?
All right. So money is not a factor, a factor. What am I doing? Gosh, I don't know. It's hard, so I have 3 kids, so I'd probably be hanging out with them a lot. Although they're getting almost to be teenagers, so I don't know if they want to hang out with dad as much.
The window's closing on that.
Yeah. Oh, it sure is. I was big into track in college, and my guess is I would probably be teaching discus and shot put for at the high school level is probably what I do.
That's a unique one. We haven't heard that one before. Well, on that note, Eric with an A, why don't you go ahead and close us out, sir?
I would be happy to. Aaron, let me just tell you from an old guy, if money's no object, your kids will hang out with you. It's wherever you want to take them, right? And there you go. I'm going to hang out in Italy? Yeah, but I'm hanging out with dad? Sure. Okay, I guess I'll do it. Yeah, anyway, I love the answer. I love the fact that you're kind of aligned with Malcolm. Malcolm's answer to that question was also teaching, and just in a different way. So that was fantastic. Aaron, thank you so much for being on the show, of course. And Malcolm, thank you so much for facilitating this and bringing him to the audience. And our last thank you goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Tech Money Podcast with Malcolm Ethridge. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Malcolm comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask that you share this podcast and leave a review, as this will help others find the show. You can connect with Malcolm on social at Malcolm on Money. We'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you have, and you can do so by emailing them to podcast@tech-money.com. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Tech Money, our hope is that this show helped make you a little smarter about your money.
This has been the Tech Money Podcast. For more information on today's topic, to review the show notes, or to catch up on past episodes, be sure to check out malcolmethridge.com/podcast. And if you have an idea for a show topic that you'd like us to cover, or you want to send us feedback, the web address again is malcolmethridge.com. You can also find Malcolm across all social media platforms at Malcolm on Money. This episode was written and created by Malcolm Ethridge, with the production, the editing and sound controls powered by Proudmouth. This has been a Malcolm on Money original. Thank you for listening. The information shared in this recording and by its guests represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not represent the views or opinions of the host. This content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. This content is not, nor is it intended to be a substitute for professional financial advice. It is always recommended that you seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your personal financial situation.